Hello everyone, you're watching a new video about adult learning and education, and today we are going to talk about adult learning and education in Wales with Kay Smith, who is the head of campaigns, policy and development at Learning and Work Institute. Hello Kay, and thank you for joining this meeting.
Prananda, that's Welsh for good afternoon, so nice to see you and meet you, and yeah, looking forward to chatting.
Nice meeting you too. So let's start. And you lead promotional activities for the Adult Learners Week and the Inspire Awards. It would be great to talk more about these activities within the scope of your experience. Let's start with the Adult Learners Week. For reference, this initiative is celebrated in over 55 countries worldwide, and it is called to highlight the value of lifelong learning, make learning and skills opportunities more accessible to everyone, celebrate the achievements of amazing people, projects, and organizations, and inspire people to discover how learning can actually change lives. In Wales, this campaign is coordinated by Learning and Work Institute in partnership with the Welsh Government and other partners. And on the campaign's website, it is mentioned that over 10,000 adults in Wales participated in a range of activities. The Adult Learning Week 2024 took place in September. And throughout the month, people could take part in free online and in-person courses, events, and sessions. Okay, so what were the most popular learning activities during September? And was there anything special about this year's campaign?
Yeah, thank you for that. So we're still analysing the results of this year's campaign, and we'll be looking through the campaign website and getting some data from that. What we do know at the moment, there were over 600 events promoted on the Adult Learners Week platform, and they were a mix of online courses, bite-sized tasters, and community outreach events, which offered advice and guidance and the chance to have a go at learning something new. So our job at Learning and Work Institute, working with our partners, is to kind of create that whole campaign activity and to encourage stakeholders to organise events and to really kind of look at their local needs and to respond to the needs locally of their communities. So to really think about who they're engaging with and to think about how they might use Adult Learners Week to engage a kind of wider audience back into their learning. So to use the campaign to inspire people to engage with them. So we leave it very much to local organisers to develop their range of events. Some of the most popular activities are informal adult learning opportunities, that kind of first step confidence building activity that might happen. But also more and more, I think people are interested in kind of pathways back into work as well. So looking at some of the kind of part-time offer that many providers have around, it could be trade skills like construction, plumbing, electrical work. It could be activity that focus around health and well-being. That's kind of very popular now, just in terms of, I think, people thinking about their own well-being. So again, those events seem to attract a good range of audiences. And outdoor education, that's another one I think that people are engaging with, that kind of chance to go out and have a go at something in their community that perhaps supports well-being around gardening or other activities like that. So there's a whole range really, and what we try and do with the campaign is to ensure that there's a real mix of activities on offer for people, so that whatever stage you are in your life, there is something that you can go along, get more information about, just make that first step. Because I think for the campaign itself, it's around confidence building, and it's about engaging with people who might not have had much access previously to education, might be a little bit worried about going back into learning. So it's about trying to make opportunities more visible, more accessible, more community-based, kind of easier for people to access and hopefully make that first step.
When I checked on your website, I noticed that there were so many activities for raising confidence about soft skills and something like that. So I guess it's something what can really engage people to take part in it. It sounds very cool, like all this wide range of activities. And hence, I have a question. How did you manage to build partnerships for this campaign? And how many resources and efforts did it take to prepare for this campaign?
So in terms of building partnerships for the campaign, that's a really important element of the work that we do. We know that the success of the campaign just wouldn't be successful without that network of partnerships that we have. I guess some of it is helped because we're a small nation. So Wales has got a population of around 4.5 million people. And we're a nation where there is a really good network of providers who deliver learning and skills opportunities. So because we're a small nation, we tend to kind of know an awful lot of those networks and the kind of key individuals or the key organisations that we want to be working with. But partnership is a really important part of what we do. So the work of my team is around maintaining relationships. So working with partners that we've worked with for many years. I mean, Adult Learners Week is a long-standing campaign in Wales. It's over 30 years old now. And so in terms of maintaining the campaign, there is almost an expectation amongst the stakeholders that we work with that Adult Learners Week will happen every year. It's never that definite, actually, because we never really know whether we've got the funding to run it every year. We negotiate annually with kind of key funders to secure funding to build the campaign. But it has got to that point now where it has got a place in the calendar, so stakeholders know to expect the campaign. And many will already be planning for the campaign before we've even announced the dates. So that's helpful, the fact that we've got that longevity of the campaign, and we've got that kind of core bank of partners there ready to work with us. But part of the work of my team and myself is around building new partnerships. So we will always take stock in the build up to the campaign to really look around and to see what's out there in terms of new developments in policy and delivery, and if there are new initiatives around that we could partner with. And so it's a lot of outreach, it's a lot of contacting individuals and organisations to explain the campaign to them and to ask for their support. And generally we get pretty good engagement. You know, you explain what the campaign is there to do. As you described, it's there to promote adult learning and skills. It's there to engage more people back in to learning. It's about raising the debate around lifelong learning and ensuring that we put the messages out to policymakers about how valuable and how important adult learning and lifelong learning is. So the campaign tries to do a number of different things. That engagement of individuals and communities is very important, but also for us, that engagement of policymakers is equally important, so that we have a debate about the future of adult learning and skills in Wales, and we have a debate about how that's funded and how it's made more accessible and how you get better routes back into learning for adults, you know, many of whom will have left school with low levels of skills and qualifications.
Yeah.
And for us, it's all about how we kind of raise participation. So that's for us the kind of key around the campaign. And then it's building a network of stakeholders who will deliver events and activities to support those aims. So it's at a number of different levels there. So we work with providers of learning to deliver those local community-based taster events, or they might be online, to reach out to their communities. But we also work with other partners and stakeholders to think about their voice around the debate about adult learning. So we might be working with other umbrella organisations, and they will be putting on their own perhaps national events or workshops or conferences to tie in with Adult Learners Week, because their focus will be on something connected with adult learning. For the campaign this year, we supported the Wales Trade Union Congress, because they were having a celebratory event around the Wales Union Learning Fund. It had been 25 years of delivering essential skills in the workplace. So they timed that event to coincide with Adult Learners Week, because they saw it as a bigger platform to make more use of what they were trying to say. So it's that mixture of local stakeholders and also national stakeholders, umbrella organisations that we can then cascade information to their networks. So we look at for facilitators, other organisations that are out there that will help spread the message to their networks that perhaps we're not in direct contact with, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And that's really important to us. So looking for new partners, building relationships, maintaining those existing partnerships. And I think the other thing that is important for us is to have a very broad net of stakeholders that we work with. So, we'll work very actively with those organisations that deliver adult learning and skills. So within further education colleges, within community education, higher education, apprenticeship providers, but also we want to think differently as well. So who else is out there reaching adults and maybe delivering informal adult learning? And that might be the museums across Wales, or it might be the Football Association and local sports coaching. To give you a couple of examples, we try and again get into our partnership a wide range of cultural, sporting, other organisations that have got that link to adult learning. They might need to be reminded of it sometimes, but they are there. And we've done some really nice things with the museums across Wales. We'll always engage in putting on some activity, and they like showcasing what they've got to offer. And that's mainly around informal adult learning, but they've been doing a lot of activity around language learning for migrants. They've been doing a lot with families, so family learning and inviting families into the museum space and doing some special events and activities as part of Adult Learners Week.
It sounds really good. I just imagined such an activity. And how does it look, like this family days in museums? Can just families visit museums and spend time there and do something interesting?
Yeah, and it depends on the type of museum, but we've got in Cardiff a Museum of Welsh Life. So for Adult Learners Week, they'll build a whole week of activity to reach different audiences. So they'll host some free events for people just to drop in and have a go. All of the events are free. They'll encourage providers of learning to come and do sessions from the museum. So they'll have that kind of partnership approach as well. And just to go back to the kind of family learning element, that's a really great link with the museums. But also for Adult Learners Week, schools are engaged as well, so that we try and again put the focus on how you reach families within a school setting. So a lot of activity, and that's been kind of growing in the last couple of years, is where providers go into schools and deliver sessions for parents in schools. So they'll do a mix of sessions, some with parents and children working together on activities, and then some purely focused on building the skills of parents. And that happens throughout the year, but they use Adult Learners Week often as a kind of launch for some of that activity. And for finding out what parents would like to learn as well. So to use the Adult Learners Week itself to kind of reach out and ask people what they'd like to learn, and do a more kind of co-produced method of learning with adults.
Yeah, that's absolutely great. And when you talked about this activity, I thought that it also about shaping up an attitude towards learning lifelong among the younger people, and it's very wise, you know, that the younger generation will also know that it's quite good, quite interesting to take part in such activities. Yeah.
So I was just going to say on that front that the kind of family learning approach is really trying to kind of develop that so that they know that if they can get a really positive environment where children feel positive about school and they're positive about their learning, then obviously that leads on to better things as they move through their school. And what the family learning approach tries to do is engage parents who may not have had a great experience at school. Many have left without qualifications and skills. Many are, you know, women who have raised a family but are perhaps looking now for pathways back into work, but with very few skills and qualifications to enable that. So the family learning approach catches people at those kind of transitions in their lives and, you know, starts to work with them. And I think, again, to go back to the confidence side of things, the confidence building with, you know, some fun activities that they get to work with their children, but then they really then get to focus on themselves and building the skills that they need and want.
Okay, I wanted to ask you about the roles of the institute, the partners, but you actually told a bit about the roles of your partners in this campaign. What is also interesting for me is the role of the government, of the Welsh government in supporting the campaign. What are the ways how the government supports you? Can you tell a bit about this?
Yeah, so we're fortunate. We've got a really kind of really good relationship with Welsh Government around the campaigns, and a minister. We've had a few ministerial changes in the last couple of years, but at a ministerial level, a real commitment, I think, and an interest in adult learning and trying to kind of drive up participation rates in adult learning. And for them to see Adult Learners Week as a kind of really important promotional tool to help try and do that. And I guess more than that, a tool that will enable that whole Wales partnership of adult learning providers to really come together and to try and work together. So we're fortunate we have a good relationship and a good commitment from Welsh Government to want to support adult learning. The funding isn't always there. I think we've had some difficult negotiations around budgets when budgets have been squeezed. But we've always managed to kind of come through all of that and find a way to deliver the campaign. So it does get Welsh Government support. As an organisation for Learning and Work Institute, we get Welsh Government support through a core grant that we negotiate annually. That is going through some changes at the moment. And then so we use some of that grant to support our work in coordinating Adult Learners Week. So as I said, you know, a really important part of what we do is building those stakeholders, building those partnerships, thinking creatively about what we want to do with the campaign and disseminating that to partners, listening to partners and shaping the campaign to their needs. And then we get additional support with Welsh Government through their communications team. And so our partnership with Welsh Government is for us to deliver the kind of core building blocks of Adult Learners Week, and then Welsh Government will provide additional budget to enable us to pay for PR and press and media. So we do some media buying through the Welsh Government comms team. So for example, this year that media budget bought some TV advertising, some radio ads, and some online press advertising. So that really adds value really to what we try and do, because the paid for promotion alerts people to the Adult Learners Week website, the platform that you mentioned, with all of the events listed there, and that drives the awareness of that platform and drives people to that platform.
Yeah,
I was going to say the other key partner in the campaign is another organisation called Careers Wales and Working Wales. So they're the national advice and guidance organisation, there to give people information and advice about opportunities to learn and pathways into work. So we combine very much with them and use their advice and information as a key part of the Adult Learners Week campaign. So all of the press and media that drives the campaign links to Careers Wales and Working Wales as well. So hopefully people seeing information will know that they can ring a helpline number or go onto the website and get either information direct from Careers Wales or go and look at our platform and see the hundreds of events that they could have a go at, which link back to local providers as well.
Okay, so you have this cooperation, which helps you to engage more people into the campaign. I'm also curious about what were the most efficient tools of communication? You mentioned media, TV, and other resources. What was the most efficient during this year, for example, if you have such information?
Yeah, I think it's really hard to pin down. I mean, I think personally, when we do our analytics on the campaign, it does show that you need a real mix. I think you need something that raises kind of national awareness. So certainly the TV and the radio help with just that awareness that it is Adult Learners Week and something is happening, and you know it gets that kind of level of awareness. I think then you have different levels of media that support that. So we work
about
with
social media. Do you work with the social media as well?
So with social media. So we do put our own social media out, but our social media probably reaches our stakeholders. So we're very active on social media for our network of stakeholders. And then what we see with our stakeholders is that kind of that cascading idea, I guess, where they're using their own social media to reach out to their communities. And they might do that in a variety of ways, like leaflet dropping still, but also on social media. Facebook, I think, has become really important. And I think for us, that is an equivalent to kind of word of mouth. That kind of Facebook and community Facebook pages is something that I think is really beneficial and something we probably try and look to grow as part of the campaign going forward. But I think having that whole mix of national broadcasting and media combined with social media and then that very local promotion and outreach probably makes it a good, real mix of activity to engage people, really. And I think one thing I would say there that we're again trying to focus on and trying to grow is using existing learners themselves. So Adult Learners Week has always been about the voice of the learner, and we've always tried to put them at the heart of the campaign. And I can mention a couple of things that we did this year, which had, really learners as the kind of centre of activity. But something I think that is really powerful to support local event activity is working with existing learners and asking existing learners to promote activity, to tell their community, to tell their friends and family about what they've been learning, what impact it's had on them, and to really help signpost people into local provision. So that's something we're really trying to look at and to try and grow through some other projects at the moment. And we're learning from others as well. So I mentioned our links with the trade unions in Wales. They have a really effective programme called Union Learner Reps, and they have a number of union learning reps that are in workplaces, and their role in those workplaces is to talk to their peers, to talk to their co-workers about learning opportunities and to signpost their co-workers to the learning opportunities that are being delivered by the union, or to kind of talk to them more about the more general opportunities that are there in the workplace. And that's proven to be really effective in terms of building, the confidence and the trust of individuals to go and make a start back at learning something new. So that's something we're really interested in.
Yeah, so it makes sense having this mix of ways. Okay, I think it's time to move on and to talk more about the Inspire Awards. There are annual Learners and Tutors Awards. And citing your website, the Learners Awards is the annual campaign to celebrate the achievements of exceptional individuals, families, community projects, and organizations who have shown outstanding passion, commitment, and drive to improve themselves, their community, or workplace through learning. And the awards have 10 nominations, such as Skills for Work, Young Adult Learner, Aging Well, Workplace Change Makers, and others. There were very different categories. There's such a wide range of categories in this campaign. And I wonder, how many applications did you receive within this campaign?
Yeah, I think there are about 11 or 12 categories currently.
Oh,
Much
more, okay.
There's a range. And the Inspire Awards for myself and the whole team are a highlight of the year, of our year's work. And they always make us smile. They always make us feel that that learners are doing an amazing job. And the fact that we get to celebrate their stories feels like a real privilege. So Inspire Awards are really important, and they're a really important part of Adult Learners Week. So we connect the two really strongly, and we do that for a reason. We always have the Inspire Awards alongside Adult Learners Week because we want to celebrate and tell the stories of people who have overcome amazing things to get back into learning. But also it really demonstrates a real impact of adult learning. Their stories always demonstrate impact, and stories are powerful. So whenever you tell an individual story, it will always make people sit up and listen. And we use Adult Learners Week to really engage with policymakers so that we tell their stories, and it gets policymakers to really think about how adult learning is working, the difference that it makes to people's lives, and at the end of the day, how and why it needs investment, and more investment mostly. So really important part of the whole fabric of Adult Learners Week. We have our awards ceremony just ahead usually of Adult Learners Week's launch, so that we have those stories out there and they're picked up in the press and media, and it adds to a little bit of an explosion of coverage for Adult Learners Week. So really important part. We start our call for nominations for the Adult Learners Week Awards around probably about 8 months, a little bit more, 8 months or so ahead of Adult Learners Week. And we put the call out there through media, through social media, through our networks of stakeholders. So we try and get as much information going about the call for nominations. And then we have a process where we have a deadline. We sift through the nominations and we come up with a short list, which then go forward to a selection panel. And the selection panel is made up of a lot of stakeholders that are external to our organisation. So key organisations, key individuals in the field of lifelong learning. And we also try and include learners as part of that selection panel as well, so that they have their voice in the selection of award winners. The numbers of nominations for the last couple of years, we've had around 200 plus nominations in, sometimes more, sometimes a little less. They usually come in right on the deadline. So we're usually left worrying for 6 months that we'll get no nominations in, and then they tend to come in a flurry. But it does take quite a bit of work from our team, I think, in terms of putting reminders out about the deadline, being very proactive with some organisations in terms of raising their awareness about the Inspire Awards, why it's important, encouraging people to enter nominations, explaining, the rationale for why we do it really, and that has generally worked. So it's when we look at the award categories, we'll review those every year and have a think about the categories of the awards. You mentioned a few of them there.
Yeah. And what influences the choice of these categories?
Yeah, we tend to think about what's current in terms of policy, national policy level, Welsh Government policy level, how we might align an award to a certain policy. And we might think through ourselves. So we'll think through our own strategy and our own work in relation to adult learning and skills. So what is it that perhaps we want to focus on or get more awareness about? And we might introduce a category that reflects something that we're interested in raising the debate around or raising awareness of, if that makes sense. So, and we try and keep a broad range of categories, so that really what we want is our adult learners, our award winners, to really reflect the whole range of adult learning. So whether that's around community learning, somebody who's perhaps learning to read and write, or that could be right through to somebody who's got a pathway onto a degree, or pathways into work is important. We also really wanted to focus on health and well-being. And again, as an organisation, we're really interested in that link between learning and health, and good health and better work. And probably strategically, we'd like to make more relationships between at a national level, the education department and the health department, and certainly at below that with our local health boards and our providers of learning, because we think that there's a real kind of benefit to be gained from working together in a better way. I think, you'll know, and we know from research, that if people have good health and well-being, it leads to better jobs, it leads to a better life.
Yeah, by the way, if people learn, they also have better well-being.
Life. And learning is key to that. So if you have somebody who's really engaged with learning, has good levels of skills, good levels of basic skills, is connected in their community, is confident, then they'll go on to have better health and well-being. So that is an example of why we kind of introduced that award, particularly to tell those kind of stories. So it's all about storytelling, the Inspire Awards. And
I think that
thinking how the category will do that storytelling for you.
Yeah, and probably it's difficult to make fewer categories because the learners are so different, and they learn different things. So it's probably it must be easier even for judges who evaluate.
It's so hard for judges.
Yeah. I can't imagine how hard it is to evaluate those applications. It must be really difficult.
I think it is a really challenging task, but we know that, and we kind of remind judges that literally, we recognise all of the nominees with a certificate, and encourage local celebrations of their learning as well. And literally what we're looking for are 12 individuals or groups to really just showcase what the rest of adult learning is about. But it can be a really difficult choice. And last year for the campaign, we introduced a Lifetime Achievement Award, and it's the first time we did that.
Okay. And again, what is it about, for just to give a reference for people who don't know, what is it?
So it was something we did, and it was as a one-off, because I think that's what I was going to try and say as well, is that trying to be adaptable around the award categories to take advantage about what might be out there that we could link to for the campaign. So the Lifetime Achievement Award we introduced, we didn't do it this year, we did it the year before.
Okay.
And it was to celebrate a special moment in someone's life that we'd become aware of. So Lifetime Achievement was there to celebrate somebody who had a really long-standing relationship with education and with learning, and had made kind of continued impact in their community. And we gave the award to a gentleman called John Gates. So John had won an Adult Learners Week award. I'll get the date wrong now and he'll remind me, but it was in about 1998. And I knew of him when he won his award then. And he won his award then because he'd come on a journey of education as somebody who'd gone into work in the coal mines in South Wales as a 14, 15-year-old. Hadn't had kind of interrupted education, but had a career working in the mines and a successful career. But he went back to learn to read and write in his 30s, and from then got on a journey of education that got him a degree from the Open University. He went on to become a community teacher and set up numerous community education groups in his community. He also goes into prisons to work with men in prisons to set up men's sheds, something called men's sheds in prisons. Alongside all of that, and it kind of adds to what John does in terms of his teaching, he's an amazing scene. He produces amazing works of art in terms of sewing. He made his daughter's wedding dress, his grandchildren's christening robes. So he produces amazing work. So he had a really interesting story that won him the award the first time around, but we wanted to kind of celebrate that kind of whole kind of journey throughout his life where learning has played such an important part of it.
Yeah, that's the story is so inspiring, and it seems to me that I saw it on the website. All the stories placed on the website are really inspiring and special, and watching them, you understand that learning lifelong makes lives better. That's just the main idea which you get, because people have a second chance in life, or like in this story about John, people come back to learning and have more opportunities in life later. So it's very important, and it influences people's lives, definitely.
And I think for him, winning the award was also about how he's inspiring and supporting other people to engage and opening up access to many more opportunities for other people. So yeah, so that's really important for us to celebrate. And in terms of working with our award winners, we try and do that not just as a one-off for the campaign, but we try and maintain contact with our award winners for as long as they want to have contact with us. So some people really want to engage with us and are really passionate about talking about their experiences and trying to support other people to get back into learning, or to use their experiences to influence government and others about, you know, developing better opportunities. So, you know, again, we kind of link that back to the campaign with ensuring that we work with learners who want to do work with us, and to find ways to get their voices to be heard through other ways as well. So we did a podcast series a few years ago and did about 8 episodes of a podcast with different learner voices themed in different ways, but getting learners just to talk about their experiences. And that might have been around pathways into higher education. It might have been about their experiences of perhaps being in care and accessing education after with being a care leaver. Different experiences, but we put them together in a podcast series that we then released as part of Adult Learners Week. And for the campaign this year, we asked 2 of our award winners to go and interview the chief executive of a new body in Wales which will regulate post-16 education. The organisation is called MEDA, and the two adult learners, we did a filmed interview with them and the chief executive, and it was a conversation between them, which was fabulous. It was them sharing their experiences, very different experience. One was an amazing Syrian woman who'd come to settle in Wales, and she was talking about her pathway back into education and how she sees the value of education for her in terms of enabling her to settle in Wales. And the other was one of our award winners from this year, who was a young man who'd kind of failed at school, but was now on a pathway with an apprenticeship. And again, his experience of finding something that was going to work for him in terms of his learning style and what he enjoyed about education, where he'd been pretty much turned off from his school experience. But they went and chatted about their own experiences, but also asked the head of MEDA about his own experiences, but also what his ambitions were for adult learning and lifelong learning within this new organisation. So that was really nice to be able to enable that to happen.
Yeah, it's great you give opportunities for people to share their stories, and you give voices to the learners, and they might inspire other people who still can hesitate about whether they should learn or not, come back to track or not. So that's great. And I think that the Learners Awards is really remarkable and visible campaign. You also have awards, Tutors Awards, to recognize outstanding effort and commitment made by tutors and mentors. Could you describe in general these awards? What is maybe in brief, but generally, what is the application process? Who can apply, and when and where do you announce winners? Just to understand what is it.
So it's a really similar process to the main awards for adult learners, and I would just say both the Inspire Awards for learners and for tutors are just a great way for generating press and media coverage. So for both awards, we get really good press coverage nationally and locally. We might get invites from radio to want to interview award winners, and certainly we get features on news programmes. So live interviews with award winners on television news and other opportunities like that. So it's great as a driver of publicity for the campaign. And in terms of the Tutor Awards, really similar process. We'll put together guidance, we'll put together a nomination form, and we'll get that out to our stakeholder contacts to encourage them to put forward tutors. So tutors have to be nominated, as do learners, nominated by it could be by one of their learners, but the process requires that tutor to be nominated, to have information put on the nomination form about them, about their teaching, what their specialism might be, and what they bring to their teaching that might be different, it might be special. What is it about them that that the person nominating them thinks that why they might win an award? So they're just asked to kind of tell that story in the nomination form. Similar process with the Learner Awards, that we have a selection panel, and we have fewer tutor awards. So we tend to focus on 6 award winners for the tutors.
Okay, so it's really fewer. And do you have any anything that motivates tutors to apply for the awards? Maybe some rewards for them or something?
There's no real incentive that we offer to apply, and I think the incentive is perhaps that recognition that comes at the end of the process. So again, everybody who applies for an award will receive a certificate of achievement for all nominees, and then we just make sure, I think, that we do a really good award ceremony for them. So for the Learner Awards, as I said, that's connected very much to Adult Learners Week, and we'll have a really beautiful evening celebration, an evening dinner for the award winners to come, and all of the kind of key stakeholders that we work with across Wales are invited to the awards ceremony. For Adult Learners Week this year, we had around 250 guests for an evening dinner. And we try and ensure that for those award winners, it's a really special evening for them, because we recognise that for many people picking up an award, it could be the first time that they've ever been recognised or celebrated in terms of their learning. So we ensure that we produce a film for each of them. We produce a press release and a case study, and we show their film as part of the evening. And we have a television presenter who will host the event for us, and she's very skilled at making people feel very at ease, very welcome. She's funny. She engages people with fun and jokes, and we have a lovely evening for each award winner to come up and show their film and have their presentation of their awards. So it's their kind of, some people describe it as the Oscars of Wales.
It sounds like a very encouraging event, and also it might be a networking for those winners of the awards. It sounds good.
It's kind of networking for those winners. They come together for the first time as a group, so they're very supportive of each other. And also for networking for those people, the stakeholders that I said are really important as part of our partnership, to bring that network of people who deliver adult learning in Wales come together for that evening. And for them, they're reminded about the value of what they do, because every story that they see on screen and on stage shows them kind of the impact that they're having on people's lives as educators. And that's really nice to see as well, just, you know, put a focus back on educators, to say thank you for the work that they do in supporting people back into learning. And also for that award ceremony, we'll have the Minister for Adult Learning there as well. So it's a good chance again for that kind of higher level engagement with politicians and policymakers. So that's for the adult learners. So a big celebration as part of Adult Learners Week. And for the tutors, we have a different timing for them. So their awards are presented currently in February annually. It's something that we're looking at whether we change potentially, and we might do that. We used to have the tutor awards as part of the adult learner awards, but again, on advice from some stakeholders, they wanted a separate event and they wanted more tutors to be celebrated. And so we decided to kind of take it out of adult learners. We can do it at a separate time of year, partly because of our kind of coordinating and time to be able to manage both the processes as well. So we'll present awards to tutors in February. We have 6 award winners. And again, with them, we'll produce a film for each of them to tell their story. And we'll produce a press release and a case study. And we'll have an event for them, usually located around the Welsh Parliament. So it'll be usually an evening event in the Welsh Parliament, hosted by a Welsh member of the Parliament, and with the Minister for Education there to present awards as well. So I think that's the kind of incentive for them, that they get their role as an educator celebrated at quite a prestigious location, in front of the Minister for Education and in front of other, you know, key stakeholders across Wales.
I see, yeah, and I think that such awards can both motivate tutors to work more productively, and also it raises awareness about adult learning as the other activities. Speaking about tutors, in some countries, in some societies, their role is underestimated, as it seems to me. And also, not everywhere you have some special programs to prepare tutors. I'd like to get to know more. Is there any special programs to prepare tutors and educators for the adult people in Wales?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think there are. Sometimes there's not enough, and not enough awareness of the role of adult educators. And it depends which type of adult learning that you're thinking of as well. So with our tutor awards, we try and recognise tutors who are working in the community with adults, with adult community learning. we try and recognise those who are working in FE college provision and in higher education and in other settings, that they might be in schools or they might be in the workplace. So we try and have a kind of whole range of settings in which tutors are working with adults and that they're celebrated as part of the awards. In terms of training for adult tutors, it depends which area of adult learning and skills that we're thinking of. So in adult community learning, yes, there's specific tutors working in that area and specific CPD for tutors to enable them to do their job, but they might be focusing on delivering basic skills for adults in the community. So looking at supporting adults to read and write, and working with adults is a specific set of skills. So, you know, those tutors will have some development to enable them to do that. We mentioned before, we were talking about a bigger role now of working with people who are settling in Wales, so refugees and asylum seekers, forced migrants. That's a real kind of there's a need in Wales to support more of that language learning for migrants, and ESOL tutors in Wales get some specific support and development to enable them to do their job in terms of teaching language and teaching languages to migrants. But there's more that can be done about that, and more specific CPD to support tutors in that field. And we're working with other colleagues across the sector to try and map out better ways of developing ESOL teachers and supporting them in their role, because things like trauma-informed approaches to teaching are really important in their work, and sometimes they don't get access to that kind of professional development, or they've highlighted that they want more. So it depends which area of adult education that you're working in, really.
I see. Okay, we discussed quite a lot. I had many questions, but I guess we covered many of them during the conversation. So thank you for sharing your experience and many inspiring stories and practices. I wish you and the Institute lots of new impressive learners and tutors success stories. And this talk was supported by DVV International Ukraine. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye.